Close your eyes and feel the immensity of time stretching behind us. Tonight, we walk through the entire human story, from the moment our ancestors first stood upright on African plains to the world we inhabit today. This is your story, the story of every person who has ever lived, the long chain of survival, innovation, and adaptation that led to this very moment. Let the sweep of human history carry you gently into sleep. Our story begins not with humans but with the creatures who would become human, in Africa roughly 7 million years ago. The climate was changing, forests receding, and grasslands spreading. In this shifting landscape, some apes began spending more time on the ground rather than in trees. Over millions of years, natural selection favored those who could walk upright on two legs, freeing their hands for other tasks. These early hominins, not yet human but our ancestors nonetheless, included species like Sahelanthropus and Ouran, known only from fragmentary fossils but representing the first steps, literally, toward humanity. Walking upright offered advantages. You could see over tall grass to spot predators or prey, you could carry food or children, you could travel longer distances more efficiently. But it came with costs: difficult childbirth due to narrower hips, vulnerability while adapting to ground life, slower running speed than four-legged animals. Yet the advantages won out, and by 4 million years ago, our ancestors were committed bipeds. Around 2.8 million years ago, something revolutionary happened. The first stone tools appeared in the archaeological record. Some curious or desperate hominin, realized that striking one rock against another could create a sharp edge useful for cutting meat, scraping hides, or digging roots. This sounds simple, but it required cognitive leaps, understanding that a rock could be transformed, planning the sequence of strikes needed, teaching others the technique. These Oldowan tools, named for Olduvai Gorge where they were first identified, were crude but effective, marking the beginning of technology. Tool use correlates with brain expansion. Larger brains require more calories, but tools allowed access to more calories through better food processing, creating a feedback loop. By 2 million years ago, Homo erectus appeared, with brains nearly twice the size of earlier hominins, standing fully upright, with body proportions similar to modern humans. Homo erectus was the first hominin to leave Africa, spreading through Asia and reaching as far as China and Indonesia by 1.8 million years ago. These migrants carried fire with them. Controlled fire use began at least 1.5 million years ago, perhaps earlier. Fire transformed human life. It provided warmth, protection from predators, light extending the day, and most importantly, it allowed cooking. Cooked food is easier to digest and provides more usable calories, further fueling brain growth. Fire also created social centers where groups gathered, telling stories, sharing knowledge, strengthening bonds. For over 1 million years, Homo erectus thrived across the Old World, remarkably successful and adaptable. But Homo erectus was not alone. The hominin family tree was bushy, with multiple species coexisting. In Africa, various species emerged and disappeared. In Europe and Western Asia, Homo heidelbergensis appeared around 700,000 years ago, and from this population arose the Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago. Neanderthals were powerfully built, adapted to Ice Age Europe, with brains as large as or larger than ours. They made sophisticated stone tools, built shelters, cared for their sick and injured, buried their dead with apparent ritual, and even created symbolic objects like eagle talons strung as jewelry. They were not brutish cavemen but successful humans adapted to harsh climates. In Asia, other human species evolved: Denisovans, known from a few fossils but genetically distinct, and Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Indonesia, standing only about 3 feet tall, surviving until perhaps 50,000 years ago. This was a world of multiple human species, different experiments in being human. Then, around 300,000 years ago in Africa, our species appeared, Homo sapiens. Early Homo sapiens in Africa looked recognizably human, with high foreheads, smaller faces, and the rounded skulls we associate with modern people. For over 200,000 years, Homo sapiens remained in Africa, slowly developing more sophisticated tools, using pigments for decoration, creating shell beads for ornamentation. Around 70,000 years ago, something changed. Some Homo sapiens began leaving Africa, moving into the Middle East, then spreading across Asia, reaching Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, an incredible achievement requiring sea voyages even when sea levels were lower. By 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens reached Europe, encountering Neanderthals who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. What happened next has been debated for decades. The two species coexisted for perhaps 10,000 years, and we know they interbred. Most people of non-African descent carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. But eventually, Neanderthals disappeared, the last populations dying out around 40,000 years ago. Whether they were outcompeted, absorbed through interbreeding, succumbed to climate change, or some combination of factors, we don't know. What's clear is that Homo sapiens proved uniquely adaptable, capable of thriving in almost any environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. The Upper Paleolithic period, from about 50,000 to 12,000 years ago, saw an explosion of human creativity. Cave paintings appeared in Europe, Africa, and Asia, stunning images of animals, handprints, abstract symbols. The caves at Lascaux and Altamira show artistic skill that rivals any modern work, with techniques like using the rock's natural contours to create three-dimensional effects and using multiple pigments to show movement. These weren't just decoration but may have had spiritual or ritual significance. Humans created Venus figurines, small sculptures of women with exaggerated features, found from France to Siberia, suggesting shared cultural ideas across vast distances. Musical instruments appeared, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, showing appreciation for sound and rhythm. Humans developed new hunting technologies, the atlatl or spear thrower, which multiplied throwing force, and eventually the bow and arrow, allowing hunting from safer distances. Humans also developed sophisticated knowledge of their environments, knowing which plants were edible, medicinal, or poisonous, tracking animal behavior and migration patterns, reading weather signs. This knowledge was preserved and transmitted through oral traditions, stories that encoded practical information while entertaining and teaching moral lessons. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum when ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe, sea levels were so low that a land bridge connected Asia to North America. Humans crossed this bridge, entering the Americas for the first time. Within a few thousand years, humans had spread from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego at South America's southern tip, adapting to every climate zone: Arctic, temperate forests, plains, deserts, rainforests, mountains. This rapid expansion required remarkable adaptability. The peopling of the Americas was one of the great human migrations, and the descendants of these first Americans developed their own diverse cultures, languages, and ways of life. By 12,000 years ago, humans inhabited every continent except Antarctica, the only large mammal to achieve truly global distribution. We had become the ultimate invasive species, apex predators, ecosystem engineers, transforming every landscape we entered. Then, around 10,000 BCE, human history pivoted fundamentally. In the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from Egypt through the Levant to Mesopotamia, humans began deliberately planting seeds and domesticating animals. This agricultural revolution, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution, transformed human existence more profoundly than any previous change. For over 90% of our species' existence, we had been hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile bands, moving with the seasons to find food. Agriculture meant settling in one place, tending crops, storing surpluses. Wild wheat, barley, lentils, and peas were domesticated, along with sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. Agriculture arose independently in multiple places: in China with rice and millet, in Mesoamerica with corn and beans, in the Andes with potatoes and quinoa, in West Africa with yams and sorghum, in New Guinea with taro and bananas. Each region domesticated local plants and animals, developing distinct agricultural systems. Agriculture allowed population growth because more food could be produced per acre than through hunting and gathering, and settled life meant women could have children more frequently since they didn't need to carry infants while migrating. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. But agriculture also brought costs: harder labor, less dietary diversity, increased disease from living closely with animals and other people, social inequality as some families accumulated more than others. Skeletal evidence shows early farmers were less healthy than hunter-gatherers, shorter, with more dental problems, signs of nutritional deficiencies, and skeletal stress from repetitive labor. Yet agriculture allowed specialization. Not everyone needed to produce food, so some could become craftspeople, priests, soldiers, administrators. Civilization, with all its glories and horrors, became possible. By 5000 BCE, True cities existed in Mesopotamia, places like Uruk with tens of thousands of inhabitants, massive temple complexes, irrigation systems, specialized craftsmen, and social hierarchies. Around 3200 BCE, writing appeared in Mesopotamia, initially for recording economic transactions, lists of grain, counts of livestock, tax receipts. But writing opened new possibilities. Laws could be codified, stories preserved, knowledge transmitted across generations without relying on memory. The Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia developed cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets. Egypt developed hieroglyphics around the same time. The Indus Valley Civilization created its own script, still undeciphered. China developed writing by 1200 BCE. Mesoamerica independently invented writing systems. Writing marked a threshold. With it, history begins in the strict sense, because we have written records rather than relying solely on archaeology. Writing allowed administration of large territories, coordination of complex projects like irrigation systems or pyramid building, and the transmission of accumulated knowledge. Libraries appeared, storing thousands of clay tablets or papyrus scrolls containing everything from administrative records to epic poetry, from astronomical observations to medical texts. The Bronze Age, beginning around 3300 BCE in the Near East, saw the development of bronze metallurgy, mixing copper with tin to create an alloy harder than either metal alone, perfect for tools and weapons. Bronze required trade networks since copper and tin deposits rarely occurred together, stimulating long-distance commerce. Cities grew into kingdoms, kingdoms into empires. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great around 2300 BCE was the world's first multi-ethnic empire, using military force and administrative skill to unite city-states. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom built the pyramids at Giza around 2500 BC, monuments requiring massive labor coordination, mathematical knowledge, and engineering skill that still impresses us today. The Great Pyramid, built for Pharaoh Khufu, originally stood 481 feet tall, made of over 2 million limestone blocks, aligned precisely with cardinal directions, built without iron tools, wheels, or pulleys. How was it done? Through human labor, ingenuity, and coordination of thousands of workers over decades. These monuments proclaimed the power of kings and gods, reminding everyone of the cosmic order with pharaohs as divine intermediaries. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world collapsed in a cascade of disasters. The Hittite Empire fell, Mycenaean Greece burned, Egypt was invaded by mysterious sea peoples, trade networks broke down, cities were abandoned, writing disappeared in many regions. The causes remain debated: invasions, earthquakes, droughts, systems collapse. But within a few decades, the interconnected Bronze Age world fragmented. Yet from collapse came renewal. Iron metallurgy spread, and iron was more democratic than bronze. Iron ore was common, and iron, though harder to work, produced superior tools and weapons. The Iron Age saw new empires rise: Assyria with its terrifying military machine conquering much of the Near East, the Neo-Babylonian Empire building the Hanging Gardens, and the Persian Empire founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BCE, eventually stretching from Egypt to India, the largest empire the world had yet seen. The Persians pioneered imperial administration, dividing their vast territories into provinces called satrapies, building roads for communication, using standardized weights and measures, and showing remarkable tolerance for local customs and religions, unusual in ancient empires. In India, the Vedic period saw the composition of the Vedas, ancient Sanskrit texts containing hymns, rituals, and philosophy that became the foundation of Hinduism. By 500 BCE, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, taught a path to enlightenment through meditation and ethical living, founding Buddhism. In China, the Zhou dynasty saw the development of Chinese philosophy. Confucius taught that proper relationships and ritual created harmonious society, while Laozi founded Taoism, emphasizing living in harmony with the Tao, the natural way. Around the Mediterranean, the Greeks were developing democracy, philosophy, science, and art as we explored in our previous journey. In the Americas, the Olmec civilization created massive stone heads and developed Mesoamerica's first complex society, while in the Andes, the Chavan culture built impressive temple complexes. Human civilization was developing simultaneously but independently in multiple centers worldwide, each creating unique solutions to universal human needs and questions. The Axial Age, as philosopher Karl Jaspers called it, occurred roughly from 800 to 200 BCE, when revolutionary thinkers appeared almost simultaneously across Eurasia. In China, Confucius and Laozi; in India, Buddha and the writers of the Upanishads; in Persia, Zoroaster; in Israel, the Hebrew prophets; in Greece, the pre-Socratic philosophers and then Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Without apparent contact, these thinkers independently moved beyond explanations based purely on myth and tradition, using reason to question, to seek universal principles, to explore ethics and metaphysics. They asked, what is the good life? What is justice? What is the nature of reality? What happens after death? These questions, and the various answers proposed, shaped the religious and philosophical traditions that still influence billions today. The Axial Age marked humanity's intellectual and spiritual coming of age, the moment when we became self-conscious, reflective, philosophical beings. In the Mediterranean, Rome rose from a small city-state to master of the entire Mediterranean world. By 146 BCE, Rome had destroyed Carthage and conquered Greece, and over the next 2 centuries, it would expand to control from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Rome's genius was practical, engineering aqueducts and roads, organizing massive armies, creating legal codes, integrating conquered peoples through granting citizenship. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, brought unprecedented stability and prosperity to the Mediterranean world for over 2 centuries. Latin became the common language of the West, Greek of the East, allowing communication across vast distances. Trade flourished, silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, all flowing through Roman markets. Roman engineering marvels like the Pont du Gard aqueduct or the Pantheon with its unreinforced concrete dome still stand, testifying to Roman technical skill. But Rome also brought cruelty, massive slavery, brutal gladiatorial games, crushing taxation, and violent suppression of rebellions. The Roman Empire was a machine of extraction, funneling wealth from provinces to Rome, maintained by military force. In the Middle East, a new religion emerged that would change world history. Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish teacher in Roman-occupied Judea, preached a message of love, forgiveness, and the coming kingdom of God. Crucified by Roman authorities around 30 CE, his followers claimed he rose from the dead and was the Messiah, the Son of God. Christianity spread through the Roman Empire despite periodic persecution, appealing especially to the poor and marginalized with its message of hope and salvation. By 313 CE, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, and by 380 CE, it was Rome's official religion. Christianity transformed from a persecuted sect to the established church, taking on Roman organizational structures and eventually outlasting the empire itself. Christianity's spread created a common cultural and intellectual framework for medieval Europe, preserving Latin literacy and classical learning through the church when secular institutions collapsed. In China, the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, unified China after the chaos following the Qin dynasty's collapse. The Han consolidated Chinese culture, making Confucianism the official state philosophy, developing civil service examinations to recruit capable administrators regardless of birth, and expanding Chinese territory into Central Asia, opening the Silk Road trade routes connecting China to Rome. Chinese innovations during this period included paper, which would eventually revolutionize communication, the wheelbarrow, improving transportation, and advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Han China and Rome never directly contacted each other, but goods flowed between them along the Silk Road, silk, porcelain, and spices moving west, gold and glass moving east, with Central Asian and Middle Eastern middlemen facilitating trade. In India, the Maurya Empire under Ashoka, 268 to 232 BCE, unified most of the Indian subcontinent. After a particularly bloody conquest, Ashoka converted to Buddhism and promoted Dharma, moral law and social welfare, through edicts carved on pillars throughout his empire. His promotion of Buddhism helped spread it beyond India to Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and eventually East Asia. Later, the Gupta Empire, 320 to 550 CE, presided over a golden age of Indian culture when Hindu mathematics developed the concept of zero and the decimal system, innovations that would eventually transform mathematics worldwide. Indian astronomers calculated planetary movements with remarkable accuracy, Surgeons performed complex operations including cataract surgery and rhinoplasty, and literature flourished with works like the Kama Sutra and the plays of Kalidasa. In the Americas, civilizations developed without contact with the Old World. The Maya in Mesoamerica built spectacular cities in the rainforest, developed a complex writing system, created an accurate calendar, and made sophisticated astronomical observations. Mayan mathematics independently developed the concept of 0 centuries before it reached Europe from India. Mayan kings ruled through divine authority, connecting the human and cosmic realms through elaborate bloodletting rituals. The classic Maya period, 250 to 900 CE, saw the height of Mayan culture before many southern cities were mysteriously abandoned, possibly due to drought, warfare, or environmental degradation. In South America, societies built massive earthworks, developed sophisticated agriculture in challenging environments, and created intricate textiles and metalwork. The stage was being set for later empires like the Inca, though they wouldn't emerge for centuries yet. As the first millennium CE progressed, the world order was shifting. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed under pressure from Germanic invasions and internal decay. The last Western emperor deposed in 476 CE. What we call the fall of Rome was more of a transformation. Roman institutions didn't disappear but evolved, mixing with Germanic customs, held together by the Catholic Church which preserved Latin literacy and provided the only Europe-wide institution. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, survived as the Byzantine Empire, continuing Roman traditions for another 1,000 years, preserving Greek learning, and developing its own magnificent culture epitomized by the Hagia Sophia's soaring dome. Byzantium's double-headed eagle looked east and west, blending Greek, Roman, and Christian traditions into something new. Meanwhile, in 7th century Arabia, the Prophet Muhammad received revelations that became the Quran, founding Islam. After Muhammad's death in 632 CE, his followers exploded out of Arabia in one of history's fastest conquests. Within a century, Islamic armies had conquered an empire stretching from Spain to India, spreading not just a religion but a civilization. Islamic scholars preserved and translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts that might otherwise have been lost, made crucial advances in mathematics, the word algebra is Arabic, developed sophisticated medicine, and created stunning architecture like the Dome of the Rock and the Alhambra. The Islamic Golden Age from the 8th to 13th centuries was a period of remarkable intellectual flowering when Baghdad's House of Wisdom attracted scholars from across the known world, and Islamic civilization was arguably the world's most advanced. Innovations like Arabic numerals, originally from India, improvements in navigation, and surgical techniques developed in the Islamic world would eventually spread to Europe, contributing to its later renaissance. In East Asia, China fragmented after the Han but reunified under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, another golden age when Chinese culture flourished. The Tang capital Chang'an was the world's largest city with over 1 million inhabitants, a cosmopolitan center where Chinese mixed with Persians, Arabs, Indians, and Central Asians. Buddhism reached its peak influence in China during the Tang before a backlash reasserted Confucian dominance. Chinese inventions proliferated. Woodblock printing allowed mass production of books, gunpowder was discovered, initially for fireworks and later weapons, and porcelain reached new heights of quality. The Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE, saw further innovations including movable type printing, the magnetic compass improving navigation, and paper money. Song China's economy was incredibly sophisticated, with long-distance trade, complex financial instruments, and urbanization rates not matched anywhere else until much later. Chinese ships traded throughout the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, spreading Chinese culture and bringing back exotic goods. Yet China remained inward-looking, seeing itself as the Middle Kingdom surrounded by lesser barbarian states who paid tribute and received civilization in return. In Southeast Asia, various kingdoms rose and fell. The Khmer Empire built the massive temple complex of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the largest religious structure in the world, while maritime kingdoms like Srivijaya controlled sea trade through the Malacca Strait. In Japan, Chinese cultural influence was strong but adapted to local conditions. Buddhism mixed with indigenous Shinto beliefs. Chinese writing was adapted to represent Japanese, and Japanese culture developed its own distinctive aesthetic emphasizing simplicity, natural beauty, and understated elegance. The samurai warrior class emerged during this period, eventually dominating Japanese society for centuries, creating a culture that valued honor, loyalty, and martial skill. In West Africa, powerful empires emerged controlling trans-Saharan trade. Ghana, not the same as modern Ghana, dominated the 8th to 11th centuries, controlling gold and salt trade. Mali succeeded it, reaching its peak under Mansa Musa, who made a famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, traveling with such extravagant wealth, giving away so much gold that he temporarily crashed the Egyptian economy, that Mali's reputation spread worldwide. Timbuktu became a center of Islamic learning, with universities and libraries rivaling any in Europe or the Middle East. Songhai later succeeded Mali, continuing the tradition of powerful West African states built on trade and learning. These empires showed that complex civilizations weren't limited to Eurasia. Africa developed its own sophisticated states and cultures, though European historians long ignored or minimized them. In Europe, the Middle Ages saw a feudal society where land was the basis of power. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for military service, and peasants worked the land, bound to the soil, owing labor and crops to their lords. It was a harsh life for most: constant labor, frequent hunger, disease, violence, and very limited freedom. Yet this period also saw the development of European universities starting in the 11th century. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, where scholars studied theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts using Latin as a common language. Gothic cathedrals soared skyward, using pointed arches and flying buttresses to create vast interior spaces filled with light streaming through stained glass, meant to inspire awe and devotion. Medieval Europe was devoutly Christian, with the Church dominating intellectual and cultural life, and crusades were launched to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The Crusades, 1095 to 1291, ultimately failed in their stated goal but increased contact between Europe and the Middle East, exposing Europeans to more advanced Islamic and Byzantine civilizations, stimulating trade and bringing back ideas and technologies that would help transform Europe. In 1206, a Mongol chieftain named Temujin united the Mongol tribes and took the title Genghis Khan, universal ruler. What followed was the largest land empire in history, as Mongol armies conquered from China to Eastern Europe. The Mongols were extraordinarily skilled horse archers and ruthless in warfare, destroying cities that resisted and massacring populations to terrorize others into submission. Yet the Mongol Empire, at its height under Genghis's successors, created unprecedented connections across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica allowed safe travel along trade routes, and goods, ideas, and diseases flowed freely. Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant, traveled to China via the Mongol Empire and returned with tales of Eastern wonders that fired European imagination. But the Mongol Empire also facilitated the spread of the Black Death, bubonic plague that originated in Central Asia, traveled along Mongol trade routes, reaching Europe in 1347 and killing perhaps a third of Europe's population over the following years. The plague's demographic catastrophe reshaped Europe. Labor shortages gave survivors more bargaining power, weakening feudalism, while the trauma challenged church authority as prayers and rituals failed to stop the disease. The medieval order was cracking. The Renaissance, beginning in 14th century Italy, saw a rebirth of interest in classical Greek and Roman culture. Wealthy Italian merchant families like the Medici patronized artists and scholars, and Renaissance humanists studied ancient texts, seeking wisdom from the classical past while developing new ideas about human potential and dignity. Renaissance art reached new heights with Leonardo da Vinci's scientific approach to painting, Michelangelo's powerful sculptures and Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes, and Raphael's harmonious compositions. These artists mastered perspective, anatomy, and composition, creating works of breathtaking beauty and technical skill. Renaissance architecture revived classical forms, building elegant palaces and churches incorporating Roman columns, domes, and proportional harmony. But the Renaissance wasn't just art, it was a new way of thinking, placing humans at the center rather than purely focusing on God, valuing individual achievement and creativity, and believing in human capacity to understand and shape the world. In 1450, Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press in Europe. China had invented it centuries earlier, but it hadn't spread west. This invention revolutionized communication. Before printing, books were copied by hand, expensive and rare. Printing made books affordable and abundant, spreading ideas faster than ever before. The first major printed book was the Gutenberg Bible, But soon printing presses were producing everything from religious texts to scientific treatises to political pamphlets. Printing made the Protestant Reformation possible. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, protesting Catholic Church corruption, printing presses spread his ideas across Europe within weeks. Luther translated the Bible into German so ordinary people could read it themselves rather than relying on priests. Protestantism fractured Christian unity, leading to religious wars that devastated Europe for over a century, but also to new emphasis on individual conscience, literacy, and questioning authority. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, reached the Americas, seeking a westward route to Asia. He never realized he'd found continents unknown to Europeans, thinking until his death he'd reached East Asia. But his voyage initiated permanent contact between the Americas and Eurasia Africa, ending tens of thousands of years of separate development. What followed was catastrophic for indigenous Americans. Europeans brought diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, to which Native Americans had no immunity. Epidemics killed perhaps 90% of the indigenous population within a century, the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Spanish conquistadors toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, using superior weapons, native allies, and disease to overcome much larger populations. The Columbian Exchange saw crops, animals, and diseases exchanged between hemispheres. Horses, cattle, wheat, and sugar went to the Americas. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco came to Europe. This exchange transformed diets and agriculture worldwide. European colonization brought brutal exploitation. Silver mines in Bolivia and Mexico worked by forced indigenous labor, plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil, and eventually the transatlantic slave trade bringing millions of Africans in chains to the Americas. Between 1500 and 1866, over 12 million Africans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, with perhaps 2 million dying during the passage. Those who survived faced lives of brutal labor producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other crops for European markets. Slavery and colonization brought immense wealth to Europe but at terrible human cost to indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries transformed human understanding of the natural world. Nicolaus Copernicus proposed that Earth orbited the Sun rather than sitting at the universe's center, challenging both common sense and religious teaching. Galileo Galilei used the newly invented telescope to observe Jupiter's moons and the phases of Venus, providing evidence for the heliocentric model. Johannes Kepler discovered that planets moved in ellipses, not perfect circles, and Isaac Newton synthesized these findings, showing that the same mathematical laws governed both falling apples and orbiting planets. Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation demonstrated that the universe operated like clockwork according to comprehensible mathematical principles. Meanwhile, developments in anatomy, chemistry, and biology laid groundwork for modern science. The scientific revolution established the scientific method, observing nature, forming hypotheses, testing through experiments, and revising theories based on evidence. This approach would prove extraordinarily powerful, eventually explaining phenomena from planetary motion to disease, from electricity to genetics. The Enlightenment of the 18th century applied reason to human society and politics. Philosophers like John Locke argued for natural rights, life, liberty, and property, that governments must protect. Montesquieu advocated for separation of powers to prevent tyranny. Voltaire championed free speech and religious tolerance. Jean-Jacques Rousseau explored social contracts and popular sovereignty. These ideas challenged traditional authority based on divine right and hereditary privilege, arguing instead for government based on consent of the governed and protection of individual rights. Enlightenment ideas spread through books, salons, and coffee houses, creating a republic of letters where educated people debated philosophy, politics, and science. These ideas would inspire revolutions that transformed the world. In 1776, American colonists declared independence from Britain, asserting that all men are created equal with unalienable rights including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American Revolution created a republic based on Enlightenment principles, though it excluded women, slaves, and Native Americans from full citizenship. In 1789, the French Revolution overthrew the monarchy, declaring liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution spiraled through increasingly radical phases, including the Reign of Terror where thousands were guillotined, before Napoleon seized power and conquered much of Europe, spreading revolutionary ideas of nationalism, legal equality, and meritocracy. Though Napoleon was eventually defeated, the world he left was transformed, the divine right of kings was finished, nationalism was ascendant, and the idea that ordinary people had rights and deserved a voice in government had taken root. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, transformed humanity as profoundly as agriculture had 10,000 years earlier. The steam engine, developed by James Watt and others, provided mechanical power independent of water, wind, or muscle. Factories using steam-powered machines could produce textiles, iron, and other goods far faster and cheaper than craftsmen. Coal powered the machines, and Britain's coal reserves fueled its industry. Railways and steamships revolutionized transportation, moving goods and people faster than ever before. Industrialization brought unprecedented wealth but also horrific working conditions, long hours in dangerous factories, child labor, polluted cities, crushing poverty for workers whose artisan skills became obsolete. The Industrial Revolution also created a new urban working class, living in crowded slums, whose numbers and concentration would eventually give them political power. By the mid-19th century, socialism emerged as a response to industrial capitalism's inequalities. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, predicting capitalism would inevitably collapse and be replaced by socialism where workers controlled the means of production. Though Marx's predictions proved wrong in many specifics, his critique of capitalism and vision of class struggle influenced labor movements, revolutions, and political thought for over a century. The 19th century saw European imperialism reach its peak. European powers, using industrial military technology, rifles, machine guns, steamships, conquered most of Africa and Asia. The British Empire became history's largest, ruling over a quarter of humanity. France, Germany, Belgium, and others carved up Africa in the scramble for Africa, with European diplomats literally drawing borders on maps with no regard for existing kingdoms, ethnic groups, or geographic realities. This colonization extracted resources and wealth while imposing European systems and often brutal repression. Resistance occurred. The Zulu fought British expansion, the Mahdi's forces defeated British-Egyptian forces in Sudan, before being crushed, and the Boxer Rebellion challenged Western presence in China, but superior industrial weapons generally prevailed. The impact of colonialism lasted long after independence. Borders that made no ethnic or geographic sense, economies oriented toward resource extraction for European benefit, disruption of traditional societies, and the psychological trauma of being told your culture and people were inferior. Decolonization in the 20th century would be complicated by these colonial legacies. Meanwhile, the United States expanded westward across North America, displacing native peoples through war, disease, and forced relocation like the Trail of Tears where thousands of Cherokee and other nations died during forced marches. By 1848, the U.S. stretched from Atlantic to Pacific, incorporating vast territories taken from Mexico. The question of whether slavery would extend into these new territories split the country, leading to the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the bloodiest war in American history, ending with slavery's abolition but also devastation of the South and a contentious peace that left racial inequality deeply entrenched. After the Civil War, the U.S. industrialized rapidly, with railroads spanning the continent, oil and steel industries emerging, and massive immigration from Europe and Asia providing labor. By 1900, the U.S. was becoming a global power, though still distant from the great power struggles of Europe. The 20th century would be humanity's most transformative and traumatic. It began with optimism. Technology was advancing, living standards rising, and many believed progress was inevitable. Then, in August 1914, World War I erupted. What began as a Balkan crisis escalated through alliance systems until all major European powers were fighting. The war introduced industrial-scale killing, machine guns, artillery, poison gas, tanks, aircraft. Millions died in trenches, gaining yards of mud at enormous cost. The war lasted 4 years, killed perhaps 20 million people, destroyed empires, Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and traumatized survivors. The Treaty of Versailles ending the war imposed harsh terms on defeated Germany, creating resentments that would fester. Russia's Tsarist regime collapsed during the war, and Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin seized power in 1917, establishing the world's first communist state. The Russian Revolution sent shockwaves worldwide, inspiring communist movements while terrifying conservatives and capitalists. The 1920s brought economic prosperity in some places but also instability. In 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression, a global economic catastrophe with mass unemployment, bank failures, and widespread poverty. Democracies struggled, and in the chaos, authoritarians offered simple solutions. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascists promised national revival through strength and unity. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis blamed Jews and others for Germany's problems, promising to restore national greatness. In Japan, militarists took control, pursuing imperial expansion in Asia. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin pursued rapid industrialization and collectivization, causing famines that killed millions while establishing a totalitarian state. These authoritarian movements rejected democracy and liberalism, embracing nationalism, militarism, and in the Nazis' case, genocidal racism. World War II erupted in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, and this time, the war truly was global. Germany conquered most of Europe with devastating speed. Japan seized much of East and Southeast Asia. The Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, seemed unstoppable until the tide slowly turned. The Soviet Union, invaded by Germany in 1941, absorbed horrific casualties. Over 20 million Soviet citizens died, but eventually pushed German forces back. The United States, entering the war after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, mobilized its industrial capacity, producing weapons and supplies that flooded to Allied forces. In the Pacific, island-hopping campaigns slowly pushed Japan back. In Europe, Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, opening a Western front while Soviets advanced from the east. The war revealed humanity's capacity for horror on unprecedented scales. The Holocaust saw Nazis systematically murder 6 million Jews along with millions of others they deemed inferior, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, political opponents, using industrial methods in death camps. Japanese forces committed atrocities in China and across Asia, including the Nanjing massacre where hundreds of thousands were killed. The war ended with atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, introducing weapons that could destroy cities in seconds and kill hundreds of thousands with long-lasting radiation effects. Japan surrendered, ending the deadliest conflict in human history with perhaps 70 to 85 million dead, countless more wounded physically and psychologically, and much of Europe and Asia in ruins. The post-war world was divided into two camps: the Western capitalist democracies led by the United States, and the communist Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union. This Cold War lasted nearly half a century, with both sides building massive nuclear arsenals capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. The threat of nuclear annihilation hung over everything, coming terrifyingly close during crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 when Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba and US missiles in Turkey brought the world to the brink of nuclear war before Kennedy and Khrushchev found a face-saving compromise. The Cold War also played out through proxy conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and numerous other conflicts where the superpowers supported opposing sides. Meanwhile, the wave of decolonization swept the globe as European empires, weakened by the war and facing independence movements, withdrew from their colonies. India gained independence from Britain in 1947, though partition into India and Pakistan caused horrific violence. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, African nations gained independence, though often facing challenges from artificial colonial borders, lack of infrastructure for self-governance, and Cold War interference as superpowers vied for influence. Liberation movements sometimes turned to violence when peaceful methods failed, as in Algeria's brutal war for independence from France, while others like Ghana achieved independence relatively peacefully. Decolonization was messy, incomplete, and contested, but by the 1970s, the age of formal European empires was essentially over. The post-war decades also brought unprecedented prosperity to the developed world. The US emerged from World War II as the world's dominant economic power, and the Marshall Plan helped rebuild Western Europe. Japan, occupied and reformed by the US, transformed into an economic powerhouse. Keynesian economics and social welfare programs created mixed economies with capitalism moderated by government intervention and safety nets. The middle class expanded, wages rose, and consumer culture flourished. Television became ubiquitous, connecting people through shared media experiences. Commercial aviation made international travel accessible to millions. Antibiotics conquered bacterial infections that had killed throughout history. Vaccines eliminated diseases like polio in developed countries. Life expectancy increased dramatically. Someone born in 1900 might expect to live 40 to 50 years, but by 2000, life expectancy in developed countries approached 80 years. These achievements were real, but they weren't universal. The developing world still struggled with poverty, disease, and political instability, and even in wealthy nations, racial minorities, women, and the poor were often excluded from prosperity. The 1960s brought social upheaval in the West. Civil rights movements challenged racial segregation and discrimination, with leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. using nonviolent resistance inspired by Gandhi to push for equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the U.S. ended legal segregation and protected voting rights, though discrimination persisted in less formal ways. Women's liberation movements demanded equal rights, challenging patriarchal structures that had existed for millennia. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique articulated women's dissatisfaction with being confined to domestic roles. The birth control pill, approved in 1960, gave women control over reproduction for the first time, transforming sexuality, marriage, and women's participation in education and careers. Youth counterculture challenged traditional authority and conservative values, opposing the Vietnam War, experimenting with drugs and communal living, and embracing rock music and sexual freedom. Environmental movements emerged as pollution, resource depletion, and species extinction became impossible to ignore. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring exposed pesticide damage to ecosystems, helping launch modern environmentalism. These movements transformed Western societies, though backlash was strong and victories incomplete. The personal became political, as people recognized that family structures, gender roles, and sexuality were political issues, not just private matters. Technology accelerated at dizzying pace. In 1969, humans walked on the moon, an achievement of engineering, mathematics, and human ambition that had been fantasy just decades before. Neil Armstrong's first steps on the lunar surface, watched by hundreds of millions on television, represented humanity's greatest adventure. Computers, initially room-sized machines used only by governments and large corporations, gradually shrank and became more powerful. The development of the microprocessor in 1971 revolutionized computing, making personal computers possible. By the 1980s, personal computers entered homes and businesses, transforming work, communication, and entertainment. The Internet, initially a government and academic network, expanded in the 1990s with the World Wide Web making it accessible to ordinary people. By 2000, email and websites were becoming commonplace, though social media and smartphones were still in the future. Each technological advance brought changes to how people worked, communicated, and understood themselves. The world was shrinking as communication became instantaneous and information became accessible in unprecedented ways. The Cold War ended unexpectedly when the Soviet Union collapsed between 1989 and 1991. The Berlin Wall, symbol of Cold War division, fell in November 1989 as East Germans poured into West Berlin, and within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into 15 independent nations. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed, mostly peacefully, as people demanded freedom and democratic governance. The end of the Cold War brought hope for a more peaceful world, though that hope proved naive. The 1990s saw ethnic conflicts explode in the former Yugoslavia, with genocides in Bosnia and Kosovo. Rwanda experienced horrific genocide in 1994 when Hutu extremists murdered perhaps 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus in just 100 days, while the international community failed to intervene effectively. The New World Order was less about superpowers and ideologies and more about ethnic conflicts, failed states, and the challenges of globalization. Globalization accelerated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Trade barriers fell, multinational corporations spread worldwide, manufacturing shifted to countries with cheap labor, and capital flowed freely across borders. The World Wide Web and later social media connected billions of people, creating a global culture where a meme could spread worldwide in hours, where events in one country were instantly visible everywhere, where teenagers in Tokyo, Toronto, and Timbuktu might follow the same celebrities, wear similar clothes, and listen to the same music. Globalization brought benefits: cheaper goods, wider choices, exposure to different cultures, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, particularly in China and India. But it also brought disruption. Manufacturing jobs disappeared in developed countries, moved to where labor was cheaper. Inequality increased within nations even as inequality between nations decreased. Local cultures felt threatened by homogenizing global culture, and the same technologies connecting people also enabled surveillance, manipulation, and the spread of misinformation. September 11, 2001, marked another turning point when Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked planes and attacked the World Trade Center and Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people. The attacks, broadcast live worldwide, shocked America out of post-Cold War complacency. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban regime harboring Al-Qaeda, beginning America's longest war, still not conclusively ended 2 decades later. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, claiming, falsely, it turned out, that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed an imminent threat. The invasion toppled Saddam Hussein but destabilized the region, leading to sectarian violence, the rise of ISIS, and humanitarian catastrophe. The war on terror expanded U.S. military presence worldwide, introduced controversial tactics like enhanced interrogation, torture, indefinite detention without trial, and mass surveillance programs revealed by whistleblower Edward Snowden in 2013. The 21st century's first decades were marked by these seemingly endless conflicts in the Middle East and the tension between security and civil liberties. The 2008 financial crisis, triggered by the collapse of the U.S. housing bubble and reckless financial practices, nearly brought down the global financial system. Banks failed, stock markets crashed, unemployment soared, and governments had to bail out financial institutions with taxpayer money, sparking rage at a system where profits were privatized but losses were socialized. The crisis revealed the fragility of a globalized financial system where problems in one country could instantly spread worldwide. Recovery was slow and uneven, and many people never fully recovered their lost wealth and security. The crisis contributed to growing political polarization and populist movements on both left and right, as people questioned a system that seemed rigged to benefit elites at ordinary people's expense. Meanwhile, climate change became undeniable. Scientists had warned for decades that burning fossil fuels was releasing carbon dioxide that trapped heat, warming the planet. By the 21st century, the evidence was overwhelming: rising temperatures, melting glacier, rising sea levels, more frequent extreme weather, shifting ecosystems. The scientific consensus was clear, yet action remained insufficient as fossil fuel interests funded disinformation and governments prioritized short-term economic concerns over long-term sustainability. Young activists like Greta Thunberg demanded action. Climate strikes mobilized millions, but progress remained frustratingly slow even as the window for preventing catastrophic warming narrowed. Climate change represents perhaps the ultimate test of humanity's ability to cooperate globally to solve a problem affecting everyone but requiring sacrifices today to prevent harm tomorrow. Technology continued its relentless advance. Smartphones, introduced with Apple's iPhone in 2007, became ubiquitous within a decade, putting powerful computers in billions of pockets, enabling constant connectivity, access to information, social media, photos, videos, and countless apps. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok transformed how people communicated, formed communities, got news, and understood the world. These platforms connected people but also created echo chambers where people only encountered confirming information, enabled harassment and hate speech, spread misinformation and conspiracy theories, and increasingly raised concerns about their effects on mental health, especially among young people. Artificial intelligence made dramatic advances with machine learning allowing computers to recognize patterns, translate languages, generate text and images, drive cars, and beat humans at complex games. By the 2020s, AI systems could generate remarkably human-like text, create original art, and assist with everything from medical diagnosis to legal research. The implications, for employment, for creativity, for privacy, for warfare, for what it means to be human, were only beginning to be grasped. The COVID-19 pandemic beginning in late 2019 became the first truly global crisis of the internet age. A novel coronavirus spreading from China rapidly became a pandemic, killing millions worldwide and forcing unprecedented lockdowns that shuttered businesses, closed schools, and confined billions to their homes. The pandemic exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities. Essential workers, often low-paid, faced exposure while privileged workers could work from home. Developing countries struggled to access vaccines while wealthy nations hoarded supplies. Misinformation spread as rapidly as the virus, with conspiracy theories and vaccine hesitancy prolonging the pandemic. Yet the pandemic also showed humanity's capacity for rapid innovation. Vaccines were developed in record time, a triumph of scientific cooperation and funding, and for resilience and adaptation as people found new ways to work, learn, socialize, and support each other through crisis. The pandemic accelerated trends already underway: remote work, online shopping, digital entertainment, telemedicine, and reliance on technology for connection when physical connection was dangerous. As we approach the present, the world faces multiple challenges simultaneously: climate change threatening ecosystems and human societies, growing inequality within and between nations, political polarization and erosion of democratic norms in many countries, mass migration driven by war, poverty, and environmental change, the rapid advance of AI and biotechnology with unclear implications, ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and elsewhere, and the fundamental question of whether humanity can govern itself wisely in an era of planetary-scale problems requiring global cooperation. Yet there are also grounds for hope. Extreme poverty has declined dramatically in recent decades. Literacy and education have spread to unprecedented levels. Renewable energy is becoming cost-competitive with fossil fuels. Medical advances continue to cure diseases and extend healthy life. And young people worldwide are more connected, informed, and engaged than any previous generation. And so here we are, you and I, at this moment in human history. From those first upright apes on African plains to cities on every continent, from stone tools to spacecraft, from cave paintings to artificial intelligence, humanity has traveled an immense distance. We are the descendants of countless generations who survived against the odds, who adapted to every environment, who created art and music and stories, who built civilizations and destroyed them, who showed both astonishing cruelty and breathtaking compassion. Every human who has ever lived, from anonymous hunter-gatherers to emperors and prophets, from the enslaved to the free, from those who left their names in history to the countless billions forgotten, every one of them is part of your heritage, part of the long chain that led to you existing in this moment. The story continues. You are living history right now, making choices that will shape the future just as past choices shaped your present. What happens next? Whether humanity meets the challenges ahead, whether we spread beyond Earth or remain confined to this single planet, whether we create a more just and sustainable world or repeat past mistakes, that remains unwritten. Rest now, knowing that you are part of something vast and ongoing, a story that began millions of years ago and continues through you, through everyone alive today, into a future we can imagine but not yet see. Sleep peacefully, heir to all of human history, and dream of what might yet be.